The world ends, and in that moment, the only thing that matters is where you are standing. Not your job title, not your bank account, not how many followers you have. Just, do you have walls? Do you have food? Do you have a plan? 5 manhua series have asked that exact question, and each one gives a completely different answer. Today, we're ranking them. Not by art style, not by chapter count, but by one brutal metric. Whose shelter actually survives? Because some of these bases are masterpieces of human ingenuity, and some of them are death traps dressed up as hope. By the end of this video, you'll know which apocalypse you'd actually want to be trapped in, and which one would kill you in the first week. But before we get to the rankings, let me tell you something that most people miss when they read these stories. Every single one of these manhua is secretly about the same thing. It's not really about zombies or ice ages or monster hordes. It's about what humans do when the rules disappear. When there's no police, no government, no social contract holding anyone back. The shelter is just the stage. The real drama is who controls it, who gets left outside, and what the person in charge is willing to do to keep the lights on. Keep that in mind as we go through each entry, because the quality of the shelter and the quality of the leader are almost always the same thing. Alright, let's set the rules for this ranking. We're judging each shelter on 5 criteria. First, physical defense. How hard is it to breach? Second, resource sustainability. Can they actually feed and power themselves long term? Third, internal governance. Is the leadership stable, or is it one bad day away from a coup? Fourth, adaptability. When the apocalypse throws something unexpected at them, do they evolve or collapse? And fifth, the human cost. What does survival actually demand from the people inside? A shelter that keeps you alive but turns you into a monster isn't really winning. With those 5 lenses in place, let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Number 5. Global Freeze, the Ice Age shelter. Now look, I know this one is going to upset some people, because Global Freeze is genuinely one of the most popular apocalypse manhua running right now. And it deserves that popularity. The art is stunning, the scale is enormous, and the premise is terrifying. The entire planet is flash frozen. Temperatures drop to -80, -90 degrees overnight. Civilization doesn't collapse gradually, it just stops. And our protagonist inherits a geothermal shelter buried deep underground. Essentially a self-contained city powered by the heat of the Earth itself. On paper, that sounds incredible. And for the first arc, it absolutely is.
So why is Global Freeze sitting at number 5? Because of what I call the inheritance problem. The shelter wasn't built by the protagonist, it was handed to him. And that distinction matters enormously, not just narratively, but structurally. When you inherit a system you didn't design, you don't fully understand its limits. You don't know which walls are load-bearing and which ones are decorative. The Global Freeze shelter has this problem baked into its DNA. The protagonist spends arc after arc discovering that the previous owner left hidden flaws, secret factions, and resource calculations that only work if everything goes perfectly.
And in an apocalypse, nothing goes perfectly. The physical defense score for global freeze is actually high. Being underground in a geothermal facility means the cold can't reach you, and surface monsters have a hard time digging through bedrock. But resource sustainability is where it starts to crack. The geothermal system requires constant maintenance by specialists, and specialists in an apocalypse are users. The moment one faction controls the engineers, they control the heat. They control life and death, and that's exactly what happens multiple times throughout the story. The internal governance of this shelter is genuinely chaotic. There are noble families, military factions, scientific guilds, and desperate refugees all crammed into the same underground city, all with competing agendas. It's less a shelter and more a pressure cooker. Where Global Freeze genuinely shines, and this is important, is in its adaptability score. When the story throws new threats at the shelter, the protagonist finds creative solutions, expanding the geothermal network, trading with surface survivors, developing cold resistance technology. The series has real ingenuity in its problem solving. But here's the thing. Ingenuity under pressure is great storytelling. It's not great shelter design. A well-designed shelter shouldn't need constant heroic intervention to stay functional. The Global Freeze Base requires its protagonist to be brilliant, lucky, and tireless every single arc, and that's a fragile system. Final score for Global Freeze: strong on spectacle, weak on stability. It's the most dramatic shelter on this list, which is exactly why it's ranked last. Number 4. The Last Fortress, Zombie Apocalypse Base Building. This one is a bit more obscure than Global Freeze, but it's got a dedicated following for good reason. The premise is clean and brutal. A former military engineer wakes up on day 1 of the zombie apocalypse with a system interface that lets him upgrade structures, craft defensive equipment, and analyze threats. He starts with nothing, literally a hardware store and a parking garage, and methodically constructs a fortress from scratch. No inheritance, no handouts. Every wall is placed deliberately. Every resource is accounted for. And that methodical approach is both the series' greatest strength and, honestly, its most significant weakness.
The physical defense of the Last Fortress is genuinely impressive in the early arcs. The protagonist understands load-bearing structures, choke points, kill zones, and layered defense. He doesn't just build walls, he builds overlapping fields of fire, moats, spike traps, and fallback positions. If you're a military history nerd, this series is basically a love letter to medieval siege defense applied to the zombie apocalypse. The resource sustainability is also strong early on. He prioritizes water collection, food production, and power generation before he prioritizes weapons. That's the right order of operations. Most survivors in these stories get the order backwards and pay for it. So, why is it at number 4 and not higher? 2 reasons. First, the governance problem. The Last Fortress protagonist is a brilliant engineer, but a mediocre leader. As the shelter grows and more survivors join, he struggles to delegate, struggles to build trust, and makes several catastrophic decisions based on pure logic that ignore human psychology. There's a brutal arc midway through the series where he expels a group of survivors he calculates to be net resource negatives,
and the fallout from that decision nearly destroys everything he built. The second problem is adaptability to non-zombie threats. When a human faction with military hardware shows up, the fortress that was perfectly designed for undead siege warfare suddenly has critical vulnerabilities. The human cost of the last fortress is also worth examining. Survival there is transactional. You contribute, you eat. You don't contribute, you leave. There's a cold efficiency to it that keeps the shelter alive, but hollows out the people inside. By the midpoint of the series, the fortress is thriving materially and dying spiritually. The protagonist eventually recognizes this, and the arc where he has to rebuild the human culture of his base, not just its physical defenses, is genuinely one of the most compelling storylines in the genre. It's a shelter that teaches you can engineer your way to physical safety and still lose everything that makes survival worth it. Solid entry, real flaws. Number 4. Number 3. Shelter X, the underground city manhua. Now we're getting into genuinely elite territory. Shelter X takes a completely different approach to the Apocalypse shelter genre. Instead of one protagonist building from scratch, it follows the administrator of a pre-built government emergency shelter designed to house 50,000 people. The apocalypse here isn't zombies or ice, it's a combination event. Solar flares knock out all electronics, followed by a mutagen release that starts transforming animals and eventually some humans into something else entirely. The shelter was built for a conventional disaster. It was not built for this.
What makes Shelter X remarkable, and what earns it the number 3 spot, is its honest portrayal of institutional collapse and institutional resilience at the same time. The shelter has rules, hierarchies, departments, and protocols, and those systems are both the shelter's greatest asset and its greatest liability. When the mutagen crisis hits, the bureaucratic response is painfully, realistically slow. Committees form, reports get filed. Meanwhile, people are dying in the lower levels. But, and this is big, when the protagonist finally cuts through the bureaucracy and gets the institutional machinery moving in the right direction, the shelter's response is overwhelming. 50,000 organized, disciplined people is a force that no ragtag survivor group can match. The physical defense of Shelter X scores extremely high. It was literally engineered by government specialists with unlimited pre-apocalypse budgets. Blast doors, redundant power systems, air filtration, the works. Resource sustainability is also excellent for the first year, after which the story gets genuinely tense about long-term food production. The internal governance is where it gets complicated. The shelter has a democratic council structure that works beautifully in calm periods and becomes a liability in crisis moments. There's a recurring tension throughout the series between democratic legitimacy and emergency authority, and the series doesn't give you easy answers. Sometimes the council makes the right call. Sometimes the protagonist has to act unilaterally and then face the political consequences. The adaptability score for Shelter X is what really sets it apart from the lower entries. Because the shelter was designed by professionals, it has upgrade pathways built in. Expansion modules, alternative power configurations, medical research facilities that can be repurposed. When the mutagen threat evolves, the shelter's scientific division evolves with it. There's a phenomenal arc where they essentially turn the mutagen research into a weapon, studying how the transformation works and developing countermeasures that give shelter residents an edge against mutated threats.
That's institutional thinking at its finest. The human cost is moderate. Shelter X asks a lot of its residents, but gives a lot back. It's the most humane shelter on this list so far. Number 3, and honestly, it was a close call with number 2.
Number 2. He built a fortified base. And yes, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know this one. This is the series that put Shad Wuxia on the map in this genre. And there's a reason for that. He built a fortified base is, in my opinion, the purest expression of what the apocalypse shelter genre can be when it's firing on all cylinders. The premise is deceptively simple. A construction foreman with a system ability that enhances his building skills wakes up to find the world overrun by dimensional rifts spawning monsters. He starts with a single abandoned factory, and over the course of the story, he turns it into something that genuinely challenges the definition of what a shelter even means. What separates He Built a Fortified Base from everything below it on this list is the protagonist's philosophy of construction. He doesn't just build defensively, he builds offensively. His shelters are designed to project power outward, not just contain safety inward. The walls aren't just walls, they're platforms for weapon emplacements. The food production zones aren't just farms, they're positioned to be defensible in case of internal revolt. Every single structural decision is made with 3 questions in mind. What does this stop? What does this enable? And what happens when it fails? That third question is what most shelter builders in this genre forget to ask. And it's the question that separates good engineers from great ones. The physical defense score is the highest on this list. The resource sustainability is exceptional. The protagonist builds vertical farms, water recycling systems, and eventually develops his own energy generation technology derived from studying the dimensional rifts themselves. That's the adaptability score right there. He doesn't just survive the dimensional rift apocalypse, he learns to harvest it. The internal governance is where He Built a Fortified Base gets genuinely interesting. The protagonist is charismatic, where the Last Fortress protagonist was cold. He builds loyalty, not just compliance. He creates a culture inside the base, ceremonies, ranks, traditions, that gives people something to fight for beyond just not dying. That cultural investment pays enormous dividends when the base faces its darkest moments. So why is it number 2 and not number 1? Honestly, it comes down to one arc. There's a point in He Built a Fortified Base where the protagonist's ambition outpaces his judgment. He expands the base so rapidly, absorbing other survivor groups, annexing territory, taking on obligations he can't yet fulfill, that the base briefly becomes more dangerous from within than from without. The internal strain of that expansion arc nearly breaks everything. And while the story resolves it brilliantly, it reveals a structural vulnerability in the base's design. It was optimized for one leader's genius. Remove that leader, or compromise his judgment, and the whole system wobbles. The number 1 shelter on this list doesn't have that problem. And that's the difference. Before we get to number 1, let me pose the question that's been building since the beginning of this video. What actually makes a shelter survive long term? Not just the first month, not just the first year, but decades, generations.
What makes a shelter become a civilization? Because that's the real goal, isn't it? Surviving the apocalypse isn't the end point, it's the beginning. The shelters that fail on this list all fail for the same underlying reason. They were designed to survive a specific threat, and they couldn't adapt when the threat changed. The shelters that succeed share one trait. They were designed around human systems, not just physical ones. Keep that in mind for number one. Number one, Apocalypse Cockroach, the ultimate survivor's shelter. Now, if you haven't read Apocalypse Cockroach, I need you to understand something before I explain why it tops this list. This is not the flashiest shelter on the list. It is not the biggest. It does not have the most advanced technology or the most dramatic upgrade system. What it has is something far more valuable. It has a protagonist who understands that the shelter is not the point. The people are the point. Zhang Xiaochang, our protagonist, starts with almost nothing. A small apartment building, a handful of survivors, no system ability, no inherited facility, no government backing. Just a man who refuses to die, and refuses to let the people around him die either. The reason Apocalypse Cockroach earns the top spot is its shelter philosophy, which is unlike anything else in the genre. Zhang Xiaochang doesn't build a shelter, he builds a community, and then he builds the shelter around the community. Every structural decision is made in consultation with the people who will live in it. Every resource allocation is transparent. Every rule is explained, debated, and enforced consistently. It sounds almost boring when I describe it like that, but in practice it creates something extraordinary. A shelter where the residents are invested in its survival not because they have nowhere else to go, but because they genuinely believe in what it represents. That psychological investment turns ordinary people into extraordinary defenders.
Let's run the 5 criteria. Physical defense. Starts low, grows methodically. Zhang Xiaochang is not an engineer, but he learns. He makes mistakes, real costly mistakes that the story doesn't paper over, and he learns from every single one. By the midpoint of the series, the shelter's physical defenses are genuinely impressive, but more importantly, they're understood by everyone inside. Every resident knows their defensive role. Every resident has trained for it. That distributed knowledge is more resilient than any single genius engineer's design. Resource sustainability. Exceptional. The community approach means resource management is everyone's responsibility, and the story shows how that shared ownership prevents the hoarding and corruption that destroys other shelters. Internal governance. This is where Apocalypse Cockroach absolutely dominates every other entry. The shelter develops a genuine governance system over time, not a dictatorship, not a bureaucratic nightmare, but something that evolves organically from the community's needs. When Zhang Xiaochang makes a bad call, and he does multiple times, there are mechanisms to challenge him, and he accepts those challenges. There's a scene that stuck with me. He's overruled by his own council on a military decision he was certain was correct. He disagrees, he argues his case, he loses the vote. And then he implements the council's decision as if it were his own, because he understands that the legitimacy of the system is worth more than being right on any single call. That scene is the entire thesis of the series in one moment.
Adaptability. The highest score on the list. Because the shelter isn't dependent on any single technology, any single resource, or any single person's genius. It can absorb shocks that would shatter the other entries. When a new monster type emerges that renders their existing defenses obsolete, the community problem solves together. When a resource runs out, the community pivots together. When a leader is lost, and the series does go there, the shelter doesn't collapse, because the leader built a system that could survive without him. That's the ultimate test of a shelter's design. Not can it survive the apocalypse, but can it survive losing its founder? Apocalypse Cockroach passes that test. None of the other entries on this list fully do.
The human cost of Apocalypse Cockroach is real. The series doesn't pretend survival is clean or painless. People die. Hard choices get made. There are moments of genuine moral darkness where Zhang Shaoqiang does things that are necessary and terrible at the same time. But the series never lets those moments become the shelter's identity. The darkness is the price of survival. The community is the reason for it. And that distinction, knowing why you're surviving, not just how, is what separates a shelter from a civilization. Final score? Apocalypse Cockroach wins on governance, wins on adaptability, wins on human cost, and wins on the only metric that ultimately matters. Would you actually want to live there? Yes. Unreservedly yes. So let's bring this all together. 5 shelters, 5 different answers to the same question. Global freeze at number 5. Spectacular, dramatic, and fundamentally fragile because it was inherited, not built. The Last Fortress at number 4. Brilliantly engineered but spiritually hollow. A shelter that forgot that humans aren't just resources. Shelter X at number 3. Institutional resilience at its finest. Held back by bureaucratic inertia and a governance system that struggles in crisis moments. He built a fortified base at number 2, the most impressive single leader shelter in the genre, with one critical vulnerability: it needs its genius to function. And Apocalypse Cockroach at number 1, the shelter that understood the assignment from day one. Build the people first. The walls will follow. Here's the thing that I keep coming back to after spending all this time with these 5 series. The apocalypse shelter genre isn't really about the apocalypse. It's about the oldest question in human civilization. How do you build something that lasts? Every society in history has faced its own version of the apocalypse. Plague, invasion, famine, collapse. And the ones that survived weren't always the ones with the strongest walls or the most resources. They were the ones with the most resilient human systems. The ones where ordinary people understood what they were defending and believed it was worth defending. That's not a fantasy trope. That's just history. And these manhua, at their best, are telling that story. Now, one thing I want to flag before you go read all 5 of these. The ranking I've given you today is based on shelter design and survivability logic. If you're asking which one is the most entertaining to read, that's a different list. Global Freeze might actually top that one. The drama, the scale, the constant crises. It's genuinely addictive storytelling. He Built a Fortified Base is probably the most satisfying power fantasy in the genre. And Apocalypse Cockroach, which tops my survival ranking, is also the most emotionally demanding read. It asks more of you as a reader. It's slower in places. It doesn't give you easy wins. But when it pays off, and it does pay off, it hits differently than anything else on this list. If you're new to the genre and want to know where to start with He Built a Fortified Base. It's the most accessible entry point. It's got the most consistent pacing, and it'll hook you immediately. Once you're deep in the genre and want something that'll genuinely challenge you, that's when you go to Apocalypse Cockroach. And if you want to see us break down any of these series in full, chapter by chapter, arc by arc, drop it in the comments. We've already covered He Built a Fortified Base in depth, and the response was, well, it's why we made this video. The next full breakdown is coming soon, and based on this ranking, I think you can guess which one it's going to be. See you there.